So, for example, we can use spectrograms. I heard that most of you know that spectrogram is in fact a visualization of sound. And the point of spectrograms is because, of course, we are way better. I mean, we are visual animals, as I said, but we are way better with our eyes than with our ears. By which I mean that variations in a bird song, we cannot hear that closely. If we hear two songs of two different birds, we cannot exactly hear or analyze the specific differences by hearing. But we can if you visualize it. If you visualize it, you immediately see, oh, there's a difference in that line. There's a difference, although however tiny it is, there's a difference in that line. So in spectrograms, we immediately see even minor differences. So, why not digitalize sound and make spectrograms out of it? Oh, why not track individuals by satellite and track them and analyze the movements they make? Or why not use videos and analyze the behavior and see patterns in the behavior? Or make algorithms find patterns in the behaviors or in the sounds or in the movements or by big data, that's what you can do by algorithms. And we can even, and so what we see is that various disciplines begin to do research on animals using digital media, digital software. For example, because sometimes already sure the psychologists are of course involved in it. Neurologists, psychologists are very interested in this area. You want to dive into the brain of animals, the cats and the dogs. And now you see what makes dogs so interesting and so well fit for this kind of research. Because I had it last week.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm Misha Kemper. I'm your professor of Eastern European Studies. Within European Studies, there's a section of Eastern European Studies. We have an own major, we have an own MA track, and we're doing Europe from an Eastern perspective. If we're doing Europe from a Western perspective, then we have a kind of view that starts from Brussels maybe, or from Bonn, Berlin, London, Paris. If we start from the East, then we usually do not start from Moscow, but we start from the peripheries. The peripheries, that is areas that are not central, are often the most interesting and the most decisive areas where conflicts play out. And obviously Yugoslavia, and especially Bosnia, but also Kosovo is such a peripheral area that you wouldn't think about, except maybe for a tourist vacation, but that are decisive for larger processes that led to the Europe that we are in now. This is why we go back to the 1990s for this incision into European history. That was the first war on European territory after the Second World War. An event that changed our worldview about processes that we thought can be taken for granted, like coming together, democratization, the expansion of Western liberal economical thinking, and that were confronted with brute force, with violence. And this confrontation played out in the European capitals, where decisions had to be made, and where the governments, but also the meetings of the European leaders, are usually reactive, running after the events as they are unfolding in those peripheries. They are the most crucial and most cruel events of the 1990s in terms of what it means to be European and what it means to be at the peripheries of Europe, being torn apart by kinds of war that we thought we had left behind, and thereby also challenging our minds in how we can resolve such conflicts or how European leaders thought about that. Last time, yesterday, I tried to bring to your attention how confused the European leaders were about what was unfolding in Yugoslavia. The unsettlement of Yugoslavia, the downfall of this federation, and the emergence of brute nationalisms that were there under the surface and that were accelerated by economic decline. Economic decline that was conditioned by the underdevelopment of the southern areas of Yugoslavia in contrast to the more wealthy northern areas. These economical disparities played a huge role in the downfall of Yugoslavia, but also the narratives that were being used. And today we look at the narratives in Yugoslavia, in what became then the independent states, as they are connected to long-term histories and making use of myth, that is, of ideas about the past, an idealized past that needs to be reinvigorated by violence. We talk about first the Bosnian War. Last time I left you right at the start of this war with the idea, how do we recognize states, new states, without giving them a carte blanche for repressing their minorities? This was the conditionality aspect that we tried to use, but obviously failed to employ, because after all the massacres did take place. Now we talk about the events that led to the ending of the Bosnian War. So I will not bring you into the nitty-gritty of the war itself, but into what for the Dutch, at least, has been the major part of the war, that is Srebrenica, the massacres of Srebrenica, and then the ending of the war, not by the Europeans, but by the Americans. After that, I will turn your vision onto Kosovo, that is a republic that is today trying to be recognized as an independent state, but that for this Yugoslav period had been a part of Serbia, and that became independent through a war in which NATO, and thereby also the Dutch and the Germans and the French and the British and the Italians, were heavily involved. A kind of different use of NATO that was in contrast to what NATO had been created to, namely a defense alliance. Now, since then, we have been employing NATO force outside of NATO territory, not for defense, but for resolving conflicts and for protecting minorities or populations. We have to keep in mind the casualty numbers. This is an estimate. About 100,000 people died, and you see most of them were Bosnian Muslims in the Bosnian War. This is without Kosovo, without Krajina. And most of them were civilians. This number reflects the way of warfare. This is not a warfare of tanks against tanks, as we knew it from the Second World War. Aircraft was almost absent, but it's about killing people by guns, simply by killing them with a machine gun or with a pistol or with a grenade. Incarcerating people into concentration camps and shooting them in mass massacres. You see that beyond the three nations that I have been telling you about from the very beginning, the Serbs, the Croats, and the Muslims that were somewhere in between and trying to establish themselves on an equal level, there were also Roma, for instance, and Jews and other nations spread all over Bosnia in smaller numbers. The outcome of the war, the Dayton Agreement, partitioned the political power of Bosnia among the three, the Croats, the Muslims, and the Serbs, and left no space for others who do not identify as Croats, Muslims, and Serbs. This is another nationalist outcome of the war. I will end this lecture with an idea of what we didn't do well with the Dayton Agreement and the kind of stalemate situation in which Bosnia, but also Kosovo, is now. And that has to do with the fact that we, after all, continued to support the war factions in the transition to a post-war period. I talked about the ethnic composition of Bosnia, which makes Bosnia very different from the other republics, simply because people live intermixed. This map is, again, it's a simplification. You have much more complex situations on the ground. These are just majorities. And you also have many people who didn't identify as Croats or as Muslims, would identify as Yugoslavians, as adhering to a kind of civic nation that is not connected to nationalist ideas. However, these people were largely forced to join one of the bigger groups that simply took over and monopolized the use of power. The complexities on the ground, and I put this into quotation marks, because this was a factor that also made it very difficult for Western leaders to understand on whose side they should be, whom they should support, and what kind of action they should take. The complexity is, first of all, that we're talking not about one war, but several ones in Yugoslavia. That is the Krajina War, the war in Slovenia, and then later the Kosovo War. But even within Bosnia, you see that there are various factions fighting against each other in different constellations. This has to do exactly with the mixed populations. Take a town like Jajce. Jajce is in central Bosnia. It was taken by the Croats, it was retaken by the Muslims, retaken by the Croats, so that populations that were constantly on the move, out and in of the city. This is then a local kind of view, a regional view on central Bosnia, which can be very different from the view on eastern Bosnia, where it would largely be Muslims suffering at the hands of Serbs. In the south, in the Herzegovina area around Mostar, you would still have other constellations, the three fighting each other, or in different constellations. With other words, for an outsider, this is very complex and difficult to understand. In order to make it easier, I now focus on the leaders. That is, the three people who eventually became the leaders of their new states. The first one is Serbia's Milosevic, Slobodan Milosevic, who came out of the system. I'm looking at their biographies briefly. I'm trying to explain to you, where do they come from? How do we understand their deeds, their actions, and their representation of their nations, of their peoples, by their biographies? Milosevic came out of the communist nomenclatura, which is the communist kind of circle of leadership in Serbia and Montenegro and in all over Yugoslavia. So he was a child of the Tito system in the sense that he came out of the political establishment. He was a political establishment figure and at the same time a populist. There are definitions of what populism is, and you might have heard about that. One major aspect of populism is that it's allegedly against the reigning elites. Populism is usually classified as an anti-elite ideology. So populists would usually be people, politicians, who appear to be talking against the elite, but for the common people. And this exactly was what Milosevic did. He always had this rhetoric of talking for the common Serb nation, and accusing the leadership of Serbia, of which he came. He was part of that regime that he then turned against. He was saying he was revolutionizing the regime in Serbia, while at the same time he was perpetuating it, because he came out of the regime, had this anti-elite rhetoric, but in reality was an elite figure and brought other elite figures into power positions. Which also means that Serbia, during the war, used the resources of Yugoslav Serbia and of the Yugoslavian National Army and of the banking system. Milosevic himself came from the banking system. So that it has a lot to do with the distribution of the existing resources, what Serbia did. Resources mean you can fuel war with that. You can buy guns and ammunition, and you can buy people who use these guns. So Serbia started this war, especially in the Krajina, but then also in Bosnia, from the position of strength because they had the resources. In Croatia, you had a very different person who also came out of the regime, Tudjman, but who was a dissident in the last decade of the regime, as a staunch nationalist. So somebody who came out of the regime, but early on distanced himself from the Yugoslav system. And finally, the leader of Bosnia, that is of the Muslim nation of Bosnia, who became leader of Bosnia-Herzegovina, Izetbegovic, came as a dissident, came as a person who was a lawyer by background, so with a civil education, and as a dissident standing for the rights of Muslims within Yugoslavia, where he was persecuted and went to prison a couple of times, and then after that became a leader of the Muslim political party. So these are the three contenders, and you see two of them are from outside of Bosnia. Milosevic is from Serbia, not from the Bosnian Serbs. Tudjman is the guy from Croatia, to the left. And only Izetbegovic is really a Bosnian leader from these three. These three will guide us through our lecture today, so it's good to keep them in mind. Milosevic, out of this system, had several positions, and this brings us into the political system that Bosnia, but also other states, inherited from the Yugoslav period. If we go through his assignments, through his professional political positions, you see he was president of the League of Communists, which means the boss of the Communist Party of Serbia, not of Yugoslavia, but of Serbia. He was then president of the presidency. Whoa, what is that? There is a presidency of Serbia, and then there's a presidency of Yugoslavia, which is 3 people, or several people, and he was one of them. And they were rotating. So in Yugoslavia, you had a very difficult system of representing the political authority by rotating presidents who came from the different republics. And Milosevic was one of them. Then he became president of Serbia, so just of Serbia, but this is in 1991, so still with the claim that Serbia is part of Yugoslavia. And then he became, finally, president of Yugoslavia. But president of Yugoslavia at a time when it was no longer in existence, when it was just Serbia and Montenegro, but still maintained the idea that Serbia and Montenegro today want to keep the rest together for Yugoslavia, were not recognized as such by the others who already had fought for their independence. Now, the important thing about Milosevic to keep in mind is also that he was not overthrown by the West. He was not overthrown by the Croats or by the Muslims. He was overthrown by his own nation, by his own Serbian people, by popular protests, which gives us an indication that not everybody in Serbia was happy with Milosevic. All through these decades, there was much unrest in Serbia, and the opposition trying to get out of the war and get rid of Milosevic, who monopolized power and very skillfully managed to stay in power in so many different positions. Every time he was in a different position, he used the authority and the resources of what this position would give him. And only by 2000, Serbia escaped from the grip of Milosevic and his wife. An important aspect of how to deal with wars is transitional justice. Transitional justice being the quest for identifying the perpetrators, criminals against human rights violation, against human rights, but also war criminals that would be governed by a different legal system. Transitional justice is new for Yugoslavia and new for Europe. The idea to come up with a tribunal for something like this was new at the time. The idea that there could be an independent tribunal that would take really a very careful and painstaking approach to the investigation of indictments, of accusations, and then come to verdicts, and then being able to catch or to obtain the criminals and bring them to court here in The Hague is very new. And it established the Netherlands on the global scene as the country that is doing this business. This January with students, we were in Vilnius, and in Vilnius you still have one of the skyscrapers on the other side of the river saying, Putin, The Hague is waiting for you. The idea that there also needs to be transitional justice for Russia. Russia never had transitional justice. In Russia and in the Soviet Union, the old system still remained intact. It was reformed a bit, but the culprits, that is the people who did commit crimes against humanity in the Stalin era or in the post-war period, were never brought to a trial. Which means sometimes the victims were rehabilitated, which means their names were cleared, but there was no compensation ever, no recognition of their suffering. Russia still continued to use the same coercion apparatus that it inherited from the Soviet Union. Transitional justice means there is a break, there is really an incision, and the period after the war should be able to look at the war period from a neutral perspective to really come to a statement about the individual culprits. I gave you an article by Peter Finci, and who worked here at NIOT for a while, and I will come back to some of his findings later on. Franjo Tuđman, so the guy who represented Croatia, and I said that Croatia is adjacent to Bosnia, so the Bosnian Croats, Catholics, would have a long border with Croatia and could be supplied with weapons and with money and with people from Croatia very easily. The same with the Bosnian Serbs, adjacent, that is neighboring Serbia. Here he came from the establishment of the Tito era and later became then the leader of Croatia, not of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but of Croatia. He created the Croatian Democratic Union as the party that for decades dominated Croatian politics, not just in Croatia, but also in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So while we have a distinction between this being a leader of Croatia, at the same time, his political party is also involved in Bosnian politics and representing the Croats in Bosnia. And finally, Izetbegovic. And every time you hear something, or you read Wikipedia articles about Izetbegovic, the first thing that comes up is a text. Very different from the other guys. A text that is called the Islamic Declaration. And the Islamic Declaration is something that he probably wrote in the 1960s. So in 1970 it was circulated, typewritten, and only in underground circles. So he came from an underground. And this Islamic Declaration is not saying Bosnia should be an Islamic state, but it is a reflection about the establishment of Muslim statehood in other parts of the world, largely in Pakistan. Pakistan came up as a state after the end of the British occupation and colonialism in India, that is in South Asia, with India and Pakistan and Bangladesh splitting from each other and becoming individual states. And Pakistan becomes a Muslim state. It is a democracy, it starts as a democracy, but as a Muslim democracy. And the idea of creating a Muslim democracy is something that inspires people all over the world, including Izetbegovic, who then writes about that. And he writes pretty clearly in his text, which you can also find online if you wish, but this is a model for a majority Muslim population country. That is, this is a model for Pakistan, maybe for Iran, maybe for another Muslim country, but he doesn't say a word about Bosnia. Still, this text was later on, 13 years later, used against him, and he was brought to prison for this as an extremist, as a terrorist, and as a person who wants to overthrow the Yugoslav regime, and he ended up in prison. When he came out again, he started his own party that then became the dominant party for the Muslims of Bosnia-Herzegovina. And in the end, he became the leader of Bosnia-Herzegovina during this wartime, when the Serbian Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina fought against the rest of Bosnia-Herzegovina. He became the representative of this Muslim core, sometimes with the Croatians and sometimes without the Croatians. He was also the person who started the referendum, that is the independence referendum that led to the outcome that Bosnia should be an independent state. And then the quest again, as I mentioned yesterday, should we recognize it or not? Should we support it or not? How can we support a state that is falling into pieces? And is there anything else we can do simply from next to isolating it? Where's this coming from? That's another room, right? That's not here. The noise. The atrocities of the war that shocked the world, and especially the Europeans, start with Sarajevo. Sarajevo, the city, was held by Muslims, but Muslims in a city that was also inhabited by Croats and by Serbs. So you often had in the city population of Sarajevo, Croats and Serbs who were fighting side by side with the Muslims against the Serbs who were holding the mountains around Sarajevo. Sarajevo being in the valley, which means it's very vulnerable to being shelled. So from the mountains, the Serbs would use their artillery to shell the inner city of Sarajevo. There is still the sniper alley, that is the area where you would have Serb snipers on top of the buildings and shooting on civilians. This was a war against civilians in order to bring down the morale. The United Nations, I told you in the beginning, that is yesterday, did two things. That is imposing an arms embargo on the whole of former Yugoslavia, thereby giving the benefit to the Serbs who already had guns and weapons and the Yugoslav army. The other thing is they established safe areas. And safe areas I will talk about later. That is this kind of reservations for people who would otherwise be persecuted or killed. And in Sarajevo, they held some positions at the airport. The airport being, of course, the only way to fly in goods. And there is still a tunnel under the airport made by Bosnians during the war in order to bring food and ammunition into the city. And the UN was trying its best to intercept that, because they had to control everything that went into the city. Otherwise, they would be shelled by the Serbs who were on the hills. With other words, the Serbian forces held the whole of the city of Sarajevo hostage, but also the UN forces that were low in numbers, had no real defense, had no or almost no weapons, and had a very limited kind of order, namely to regulate the flow of goods into Sarajevo and prevent Sarajevo from getting any kind of military stuff to defend itself. So people in Sarajevo were very inventive, and there are still lots of musea in Sarajevo itself that are worth visiting. Now, the easiest thing to say as an observer from the outside is, hey, if there's Croatia and there's Serbia and there are Serbs and Croats living in Bosnia, why don't we partition the country and split it up so that Serbia gets one part and Croatia gets the other? This was also the natural idea of the leaders of Serbia and Croatia in the very beginning. So they met, Slobodan Milosevic and Franjo Tuđman, and drew a line crisscrossing Bosnia in an effort to simply divide the country amongst themselves. For the Muslims, this would have been devastating. They would have no representation at all anymore and would be cut in pieces between these two. And of course, if we consider the atrocities that took place while these guys were already preparing the partition of Bosnia, you can understand that this would mean the complete annihilation or expulsion of the non-Serbs and non-Croats. These deliberations led to nothing also on international pressure. International pressure soon focused on preserving Bosnia as it was. Last time I introduced to you the Badinter Commission, that is the European Community's institution for making statements about the future of Yugoslavia. And I said, the Badinter Commission came up with the idea, hey, are you saying something? Are you okay? No. Shall we go somewhere and ask whether we can stop the music? Is it bothering you? Where did it come from? Hey, the Badinter Committee that said, on the one hand, Yugoslavia is falling apart. Second, we should aim to maintain the internal boundaries of Yugoslavia as it was before, without Yugoslavia. And this is exactly then the stance of the Europeans, saying we have to come to terms with this. Bosnia and Herzegovina, so this one state, must be preserved at all costs. We cannot allow for a destruction for taking this apart, because the ethnic composition is so mixed that any recipe for cutting it into pieces and giving it to Croatia or to Serbia or however would lead to more atrocities. So the European focuses were on these plans that somehow had to come to terms with this complexity of ethnic settlements. And you see the areas, this would be a map of the Muslim and Serb and Croat majorities. And these were the plans that were then made in order to still cut Yugoslavia, Bosnia-Herzegovina into pieces, so that the Muslims get some majority areas, and the Serbs get some majority areas, and the Croats get some of their majority areas. So from the very beginning, the war was accompanied by European thinking about how Bosnia can, on the one hand, be preserved, no? But at the second time, also, how can all the three major constituencies be satisfied by getting a piece of the cake at the same time? So no idea of creating a unitary Bosnia, but from the very beginning, cutting it into pieces in order to preserve it. And we will see that this is exactly what happened. So while these plans are being made in European capitals, Europe is very uneasy about any kind of interaction, of implementation of that. Would always rely back on Tudjman and on Milosevic in order to make proposals that would then be rejected, talking to the Bosnian Serb leaders as well, because they were obviously in the position of power. Last time I showed you a map of 1995 when the Serbs held more than half of the country. So we claim to be peacekeeping or to try to implement peace, but there is no unity among the European governments, with some being more hesitant, some being more pro-Serb, and some being more pro-Croat. The United Nations peacekeeping force, so UN-PROFOR, came into the area, but had only a very limited mandate. The sanctions did not really work out. On the one hand, they can easily be circumvented. On the other hand, they largely gave an advantage to the Serbs. In the end, we end up remembering the war with the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia that was established already in 1993, at an early point when it was clear that this is completely going wrong. But of course, then it needed a lot of time in order to come to a procedure and also to apprehend the people, the persons whom we would like to see before trial. In the end, it is not the Europeans that put pressure on the warring factions, but the Americans. So you see here, this is in the White House. It's Bill Clinton who is watching how two leaders, namely the Muslim leader, Izetbegovic, and the Croatian president of Croatia, outside of Bosnia, signed the memorandum that says Muslims and Croats will be now together in one unit. This is a crucial period because it means that Bosnia will now have one unit that is Muslim and Croat. And at this time, they're still fighting against the Serbs. So this is the first event, but the game changer is Srebrenica itself. So this one enclave where Dutch forces, the Dutch bat, a couple of hundred people, are in charge, responsible for protecting the Muslims in the eastern part of Bosnia that fled to the area and to protect them against the attacking Serbian forces. The Dutch bat was equipped with very light arms and very weak command structures. If you look at this map, which is from the Srebrenica committee, you see that Srebrenica stands out for the atrocities, more than 8,000 people killed. These are mostly men and boys, because the Serb forces divided the boys into one direction, and the women, most of the women and daughters were bussed then away to other places. But the men were killed, oftentimes in groups, brought to the forest and simply shot. So the area around Srebrenica is still full of these killing sites. Killing sites that are today dilapidating and that are not protected, that are still, imagine you have a Holocaust memorial that is simply dilapidating. This is what is happening in the Serbian part of Bosnia. But you see from the numbers here in terms of killings, in terms of executions, there are also other places where that has been going on a massive scale, including in Prijedor. So what happened in the Srebrenica massacre is what I think what Honig describes in the article that I gave you to read. Srebrenica is in a valley, and the Dutch people, here you see Karremans, who was the officer in charge of this Dutch battalion there, not being able to withhold the Serbians from attacking and from taking it. The Serbs, the Bosnian Serbs, right? The Bosnian forces under Ratko Mladic, this guy who will also accompany us today, the Bosnian forces had been going forward to Srebrenica and then retreating again several times. A kind of ritual, a kind of idea to make the Dutch accustomed to the Serb forces being approaching and then being retreating again. Which means there were no alarm bells ringing. When our alarm bells were ringing, the Dutch forces, with their very limited equipment, would have to call in Air Force. And Air Force was NATO Air Force, largely based in Italy at that time. So then Italian, French, German, whatever, Mirage and Typhoons would stand up, would go up, and F-16, and would draw some circles over Srebrenica in order to impose themselves on the Serbs, so that the Serbs would go back into the bushes and retreat again. Airstrikes against invading infantry is very difficult, especially in a situation like this, where people would be hiding, people would be not in uniform, not in big units, but just 5 people going into the village and making killings. Which means the Western imposition of the UN mandate of the protection of this area was anything but safe. It was not safe at all. And so at one point, Mladic simply moves into the compound, into the area, and the Muslims escape into another direction, into Potocari, you see that here, a little further off, and the Dutch do not resist. This is a trauma for the Netherlands, and it has led to a downfall of a government, to a very mild report by NIOD, by the Dutch Institute for War and Holocaust documentation, here connected to our university. And it is still something that many Dutch veterans, people who stood by, who were forced to stand by when the Serbian forces invaded Srebrenica, are suffering from. The traumas are still very, very vivid in many families in the Netherlands. There is also a research project at this university within European studies about the photos that had been taken by Dutch veterans, that is by people who were there as soldiers, who photographed everything from how they spent their days there to the atrocities, that is, to the ways how the Serbs came in, split the people, brought them on buses, and abducted the men into the woods. The project by Guido Snell, by our colleague, is bringing together the photographs of Dutch veterans that are still in family archives in the Netherlands, and the photographs made by civilians, by Bosnians who were the victims of this, especially, of course, those who survived, those women who were then bused to Muslim cities, to Tuzla in the first place. Yeah? So this was a very humiliating position for the Dutch for the Netherlands, but also for Europe as a whole. In the end, this was the trigger. This was when also the Western public sphere, when the newspapers, the media understood that we cannot stand by anymore. But at the same time, Europe doesn't have an air force. Europe doesn't have a defense minister at that time. So what's happening is the Americans are coming in. Americans, that is under Bill Clinton, finally understand that in order to protect the population, you need more than that. You need more than just these safe areas with weak representation of the United Nations. What's happening in Krajina is connected to that. Krajina, I introduced to you as the area in Croatia where Serbs formed a majority. And this Krajina Republic that they set up in 1991 was the kind of trigger of the whole war, with the idea that the Krajina Republic would be broadened out into Bosnia and then be linked to Serbia so that you get one bridgehead from Serbia to the Krajina Republic, and then you get a hold of Serbia on Bosnia and on Croatia. The Krajina Republic was all through this war still there, but by August 1995, that is at the same time that this Srebrenica thing happened, the Croatian forces were able to regain this territory. And this brings us to another point that I raised yesterday, namely the promise of autonomy. The idea from European leaders at the beginning of the war that states, including Croatia, have to recognize the autonomy of areas or of citizens who are not Croats. In the case of Krajina, this failed because what Croatia then did is simply recapturing the area and doing the same that the Serbs did in the beginning, namely expelling most of the population. With other words, for Croatia, the end of the war brought another problem. Yes, they won Krajina back, but they would also have to apply all the rules that we imposed on Serbia, namely allowing refugees to return, including then here, Serbian refugees going back to Krajina. Every refugee comes with a claim of their own house, of their apartment, of whatever they lost, but they also come with the trauma of having lost relatives or of having suffered in the war. This was done very much with American support, logistics, training, and also with much of European consent, because the idea being that now it's time to rein in the Serbs, Slobodan Milosevic, for all the atrocities the Serbs committed, and Krajina was the first thing to go. So this happened in 1995. By December of that year, the American force, the American authority pressed Slobodan Milosevic to the table as well, and they signed the Dayton Agreement. So again, it's an American event, it happens in Ohio, and it means the partition of Bosnia. The partition and the preservation of Bosnia. So Bosnia can only be preserved if it is divided into two parts, one being the Serbian Republic of Bosnia and one being the Federation of the Croats and of the Muslims. It is again a matter of percentages, so we are still negotiating how much do the Serbs get, how much do the Bosnians get. In the end here, you see that the Serbs get most of it in terms of territory, but the Muslims gain, for instance, the city of Sarajevo, and the Croats lose a bit. What is the Dayton Agreement? Now, 3 minutes to go before the break. The Dayton Agreement for preserving Bosnia, according to Sicut Possedietis Juris, as you had it before, the unit of Bosnia must be preserved, but partition it into the Republic of Serbia part, which is not Serbia, because Serbia is the neighboring country to the right, and a federation of Muslims and Croats in Bosnia. At the same time, it is also a further partition of Bosnia into cantons. Cantons is like bigger districts, regions. And this is now the result of negotiations that took place about how should Bosnia be organized, including the Serbian Republic and including the Federation. Once again, the Serbian Republic of Bosnia is part of Bosnia. What you see is we have 10 districts, 10 of these cantons, and that means you have a huge amount of administrative overload. You suddenly have prime ministers and presidents of 10 cantons, plus of each of these two bigger units, in the federation also of the Croat and of the Muslim part, and then also on the Bosnian level. With other words, Bosnia just gets an overflow of administrative positions, I would say, and councils and rotating structures to make sure that all of the three sides can be living with this. So agreements on the canton area level, agreements on the two units of Bosnia, and agreements on the Bosnian level, on the, so to say, national level. That is not the nation's level, but the kind of civic level of what it means. With other words, the outcome of this war is an end of the war, which is good, which Dayton brought. Dayton brought an end of these atrocities. 100,000 people died. Dayton brings an end to it. But at the same time, it creates a structure that is highly complex and that is very much depending on the local forces. And the local forces, that is those people that would be the new presidents of these districts, and the presidents on the level of Bosnia-Herzegovina, were also the guys who were fighting in the war for their constituencies. With other words, Dayton did not do transitional justice, but perpetuated the divisions of the wartime and gave legitimacy to the wartime leaders. The people who, during the war, were fighting each other are now being put into the position of governing the areas that Dayton carves out for themselves. You see that this is only possible by a huge number of peacekeepers. In the beginning, 60,000. This number has been reduced by now, but there are still peacekeepers. There are still European agencies in Bosnia-Herzegovina to keep this country together. And this is where we start again after the break. Many thanks.
there's also a chapter about plants in it. And again, and I can't stress this enough, these are not, Karen Barker is not an animal whisperer in any way. This is hard science that she's doing. But realizing that it is hard science to talk about talking animals, and again, think about how I told you an hour ago that until quite recently we thought that was just a children's fantasy, but now we do hard science on trying to understand the meaning of animal communication. And this is what is happening, and well, maybe to give it a personal note, let's say some 10 or maybe a bit shorter, let's say some 10 years ago when we first heard and used Facebook and YouTube, etc., especially Facebook, people told colleagues here at our Department of Communication who do research on the digital media said, well, the Mark Zuckerbergs of this world already know by our faces without knowing anything else. They see feelings and they know things about us that even we ourselves don't know. And connect that to some other data, and they know even more about me than I would ever expect, or I would even know myself. And by that moment, I realized, I suddenly thought, well, if we don't need speech, or if we don't need any regular communication, wouldn't it be interested? I mean, you don't need a bit by now. So I thought about myself, it would be interesting to know what goes on in the mind of my cat, because that's the ultimate question that still is the one in my head. But then I thought, well, okay, I'm sort of a strange animal guy, and probably no one else is interested in such a kind of question. That, of course, was the most stupid thought I ever had, because of course people are interested for all sorts of reasons in what goes on in the minds of other animals. So, what you see is, and this is the topic of Karen Barker's book, The Sound of Life, what is interesting that now we began starting out, even before the launch of the interspecies internet in 2013, we began to realize with the advance of digital media what the possibilities of digital media are. There were an enormous lot of people worldwide who were interested also in aliens and in communication with the animals amongst us. And what you see is, and maybe you also realize that when I showed you this this image of the dogs introducing digital media, that all kinds of all disciplinary kinds of researchers and scholars began to be interested in what does that mean for my discipline? How could I contribute to understanding non-human animals? And that is what has been going on since then, and what developed over time, and what accelerated over the last decade, or actually over the last 5 years, or actually over the last 3 years, or actually, you realize the book is of 2022, so it's already more than 3 years old. Then again, this is a brilliant overview of the recent research, that is, of course, until 2022, the recent research all over the world by interdisciplinary teams doing research on animal communication amongst them and to us. And okay, so You've read one chapter, or you can read one chapter of the book, one of the final chapters of that book. But to give you an overview of the development and the general idea of the direction where it goes to from Kara herself. She gave a TED talk in 2023 on the very topic of her book and what goes on in science at the moment. What are the views in the future that she developed, reading all this kind of research by various disciplinary researchers. What have we discovered so far, and in what direction does it go? Let's give the floor for about 12 minutes to Karen Barker. That is, if
debate about how artificial intelligence will change human society, but have you thought about how AI will transform your relationship to the non-human world? So these are bioacoustic recorders, and I've spent years studying how scientists use devices like this, combined with AI, to listen to the hidden sounds of nature and decode non-human communication. Hidden sounds because much acoustic communication in nature occurs in the high ultrasound above your hearing range or in the deep infrasound below your hearing range. So I'm going to play a sound. I want you to listen and try to guess who or what this is. So that was bat ultrasound recorded above your hearing range, but slowed down so you could hear. So that was an advertisement call from the peak of the mating season. Scientists can decode these calls, so a sample back to English translation would be, and I quote, "Pay attention. I'm a Pipistrellus natusi bat, specifically male. My name is X. I am landing here, and we share a common social identity and common communication pool." For a pickup line by a bat, not bad. So scientists have recorded millions of bat vocalizations like this, and they've decoded many of them using AI. And they've revealed that bats have dialects that they pass down from one generation to the next, and that baby bats learn to speak just like you did by listening to the adults around them and babbling back until they speak adult bat. So bats have far more complex communication than we do, and they're only one of many examples. Listen to this. So those are orcas, who live right here in the Salish Sea. Scientists can decode individual orca calls using AI. They reveal that orcas also pass down their dialects from one generation to the next. So it turns out that orcas and bats are not the only creatures that make ultrasound. Moths, mice, beetles, rats, even some of our smaller primate cousins like this tarsier. At the other end, in the deep infrasound, elephants and whales, tigers, and some birds make sound. So when we first learn about these secret sounds of the world, we're often surprised because humans tend to believe that what we cannot perceive does not exist. And so we miss a lot. One of my favorite examples is this peacock. So to you, this looks like a visual mating display, and it is. But this peacock is also making very loud infrasound with its tail, which you cannot hear, but female peacocks can, and it is an important factor in their mating decisions. So this peacock is giving a rock concert. Now, we have lived with peacocks for millennia, but we only just figured this out. Scientists also used to think that turtles were voiceless, and mother turtles abandoned their nests after laying their eggs. But we just discovered that baby Amazonian turtles communicate through their shells before they hatch to coordinate the moment of their birth and then follow their mother's calls to safety in the water. Even creatures without ears are exquisitely sensitive to sound. So this is a coral larva. When coral larvae are born, usually at a mass spawning event, a few days after the full moon, they wash out to sea. So scientists used to think that these little larvae, these tiny dots that you see here, were helpless, randomly pushed around by wind and waves and currents. But it turns out that coral larvae are acoustically attuned. They can hear the sounds of healthy reefs. They can hear the sound of their home reef, their mother reef, and they swim back home across miles of open ocean. So these are tiny creatures with no central nervous system. But we think they do that with these hairs that you see on the outside of their bodies. They're a lot like the hairs inside your ears that are enabling you to listen to me right now. So you can think of a coral larva a little bit like an inside-out ear, except that its sense of hearing is profoundly more sensitive than your own because they hear with their entire bodies. Even our planet makes sound. Volcanoes, earthquakes, sounds so low and strong and powerful they travel very far, passing through soil and stone and even solid walls. Listen to this hydrothermal vent deep under the ocean. So in nature, sound is everywhere, and silence is an illusion. So scientists are also listening to the vast extent of interspecies communication. So this bat is using ultrasound to hunt this moth. Its echolocation beam is locked onto its prey. But the moth is also emitting ultrasound. It's jamming the bat sonar in an attempt to escape. This plant is also emitting ultrasound, which varies depending on its condition. Scientists have trained an algorithm to listen to this plant simply by listening. It can detect with about 70% accuracy whether the plant is healthy, dehydrated, or injured. So this is peer-reviewed research, by the way. So we cannot hear these sounds, but we think many insects can. Does this mean that humans could use digital tech to one day communicate with other species? Well, some scientists think so, and they're using machine learning to try to decode the acoustics of other species. So there are teams of computer scientists and linguists and biologists working on decoding sperm whale bioacoustics. They're also building entire dictionaries. So there's an elephant dictionary with thousands of sounds. Elephants, for example, have a specific signal for honeybee. So I'd love to share just one of these sounds with you. It was recorded at a moment of great joy and celebration, the birth of a new baby. So the further we listen across the tree of life, the more complex interspecies communication would be. Listen to this honeybee. Now, listen to this honeybee queen. So you thought you knew what honeybees sounded like. Okay. Honeybee communication is incredibly complex. It's acoustic, positional, spatial, vibrational. The queen has her own signals. So scientists are encoding these signals into robots. This robot is attempting but not succeeding to communicate with the hive. The bees mostly ignore or attack it. But one day, we hope, the inventors hope, that this robot will communicate well enough to allow scientists to monitor the health of the hive. Now, would that be a good thing? Some believe that interspecies communication would help foster respect and empathy for nature. Others believe that it is profoundly disrespectful.
Thank you for coming back. Hey, in the break, Gabrielle came to me. Gabrielle from Brazil, here. She asked whether, in order to do the track, the major in Eastern European studies, whether you need to have an Eastern European language background or having taken one of these languages here at the university. No. Whatever language you bring, you will be able to use it. Yeah? Then I saw Noel, here from Switzerland. What question did you ask? Yeah, that's one thing. You asked about why did the West not identify the Serbs as the initial culprits, the starters of the violence, and then act accordingly. Now, the responses to this question has to do with the Western vision of Yugoslavia, and there this idea of complexity works for Milosevic and for the Serbs. The idea being, this is so complicated, once we get involved, we'll never get out again. We cannot even define our priorities. That's one point. The other point is, in order to curb the Serbs, so the idea was, we have to bring in enormous amounts of troops. But we are not used to that. Our armies are defense armies in the Cold War period. We are not ready to do that. And we're not ready to suffer casualties for that. And the question is also, why was the Srebrenica enclave so easily run over by the Serbs? On the one hand, this has to do with the light armor that the Dutch bat had. That is, they were unable to defend the area. It also has to do with the lack of coordination of the Air Force coming from Italy and the lack of a clear command structure in NATO and with the United Nations and with the Dutch government here in The Hague. But it also has to do with a mental kind of barrier to risk your own soldiers' lives. As an officer, you have responsibility before your soldiers, so you try to protect them. And then you protect them when the enemy is running over your compound and is taking the people that you are supposed to protect as hostages or as prisoners. But then the idea of a soldier is these people would be brought away, maybe they would be held captives, but the idea that they would be shot right on the ground within a couple of days was very alien to the Dutch command structure. Because they were thinking they were fighting or they were visiting a war scenario, not the atrocities that were happening on the ground in Bosnia and Herzegovina at that time. So a kind of limited creative possibility to understand what was really threatening the people in the compound. Yeah. And then we also in our conversation came to the question of, is it different from the situation that we're in today with Putin? Well, the West been very hesitant to react upon Putin's invasion of Ukraine in 2014. This is when the Crimea was annexed and when the Donbas war started on Putin's behalf. And then when Putin invaded the country wholesale from various directions in 22. Then also there was an outcry in the world, in the West, but there were very limited actions being taken. Now the difference, of course, being that Putin is standing for a nuclear power that is Russia, but the same kind of hesitance to be able to really point the finger at the only possibility, namely to stop Putin by defending the Ukrainians. And then the arms deliveries and the ammunition deliveries and also the moral support for Ukraine, that took half a year in order to really overcome the mental barrier, to the understanding, the awareness that this is Ukraine also fighting a war for us. Coming back to Yugoslavia, Kosovo is the second place of atrocities in this line of wars. Brief background, Kosovo was occupied by Serbia in various wars, ended up being a province of Serbia in Yugoslavia, a province which has a low level of autonomy. And this meant that the Serb forces in Yugoslavia during the 1950s and 60s repressed the Kosovo Albanians and tried to bring in more Serbs. You see the numbers of Serbs is pretty high in the beginning here, 28% in the 1950s. Today it's very low. Today it's less than 10% probably. Which means demographics again play a role. Demographics means the division of the country between populations that call themselves Serbs and Orthodox and Christians, and populations that call themselves Kosovo Albanians, most of which are Muslim. Which means the confrontation is also between religions, and religion being a commodity, a resource that is being used in the narratives that are being spread to mobilize populations for war. From the paradigm of economic development, you already understand that Kosovo is one of the most marginal areas of Yugoslavia and of Serbia as well. The least development, much agriculture, high unemployment, less schools, less universities. There's only one university, and that's Serbian-speaking in Pristina in Yugoslav times. And on top of that, you see that Albanians in Yugoslavia, not in Albania proper, but Albanians live in Kosovo, but also in Macedonia. Macedonia, a republic that I leave out of the consideration here, has a very complex ethnic makeup, including those 400,000 Albanians that live in Macedonia, in addition to Turks and to Macedonian Orthodox and to Serbs and so forth. With other words, on the one hand, yes, a very difficult ethnic makeup, but a clear majority of Albanians that during most of the Yugoslav period were disadvantaged, were repressed, were held back by the Serbs. When Milosevic comes to power, that is when he usurps power in Serbia and then in Yugoslavia and then in rump Yugoslavia, he starts by pointing to Kosovo. Kosovo is, in his rhetoric, the cradle of Serbian identity and Serbian history, and therefore needs to be strongly made part of Serbia, to not allow the consideration coming up that Kosovo would be for the Albanians that form the majority. So what the Serbs do is they use, that is what Milosevic is organizing, the Serb media, the Yugoslav media, the Serb administration, to bring people to Kosovo and to reduce the autonomy, to take away the autonomy. That is, people from Serbia are being bussed, are being taken on buses into Kosovo to protest there in front of the Kosovo parliament, so that the parliament resigns and the parliament is being taken over by Serbians. The same is taking place in another province of Serbia, which is Vojvodina. And I had that here, here on this map. You see Serbia here with Kosovo province red, but the north of Serbia has a minority, 30% or so, of Hungarian speakers. These are partly territories that were taken away from Hungary in several wars. With other words, the autonomies on low level that Vojvodina in the north and Kosovo had in the south, that they had obtained in the last decade of the Yugoslav period, were taken away by Milosevic. His power is very much coming, his authority in Serbia, he's building up with the idea that he's reducing the autonomies and creating a unified Serbia again, as he would say, Serbia that never existed in this form, others would say, in order to project himself as the almost messiah figure, the kind of messiah that Serbia has been waiting for in order to become great again. So he reduces the autonomies, abolishes the autonomies, and inserts direct rule. Inserting direct rule on a province that is inhabited for the most part by others means police force and partly army force. It also means repression by the court system and by the educational system that is not allowing Albanians to go to high schools or to universities. And of course, taking over the economies as well. So a kind of colonialism in the late Yugoslav and early post-Yugoslav period. And this identity-based political movement of Serbia is based on historical argument, historical grievances. In 1989, that is, we're still in the Yugoslav period, when Milosevic is on the rise within the Yugoslav elite in the Communist Party still, he is using the celebration of a historical event in Kosovo in order to rally the crowds behind him. With other words, he starts his populism career, if you wish, in Kosovo. He becomes a populist by drawing the Serbs to this memory of the Kosovo-Polje battle. The Kosovo-Polje battle is something that happened in 1389 in Kosovo, and you see here a map of the Ottoman Empire, and you might remember the Ottoman Empire from our Constructing Europe part, where we started with the conquest of Istanbul in the 15th century, and then discussed the legacy of the Ottoman Empire in Europe. And you see here the Ottoman Empire at its largest extent. It covered not just Greece and Bulgaria and Romania, but also Bosnia and Serbia, of course. And one of the crucial events of the battles that have been celebrated as the victory of the Ottomans or celebrated as the tragic defeat of the Christians is the Battle of 1389 of Kosovo. That is, Kosovo as a name has a place in Serbian history as the incarnation of the rule of the Turks, as the Serbs would call the Ottomans, that is a foreign Muslim rule over Serbia and then broader over Christian nations, which cemented the idea that the Serbs have been defending European and Christian civilization against the Muslim world, that they suffered for 400 years under Muslim overlordship, and that they then vanquished the Muslims, the Ottoman Empire, and came out of this as a principality, the Serb principality, and then the kingdom of the Serbs, and then Yugoslavia. So the idea, and you have similar ideas in Bulgaria or in Romania, that first the Ottoman rule had to be, that is, the nation had to be liberated from the Ottomans, and then to come out and make a bridge to the period before the Ottomans came. You have the same in Spain with the Reconquista, the idea that Spain, after the Reconquista, after the defeating of the Arabs that held most of Spain for how many years? For 500 years. That this is a rejuvenation of the Christian empire before that time. For the historian, this is a very complicated approach, because the Spain before the Muslims came over in the 8th century, it was a very different Spain, very much fragmented, than the Spain that emerged out of the Reconquista. The same here. The Balkans before the Ottomans were very fragmented, and there was not one Serbian nation or one Christian nation standing up against the Ottomans. And when the Ottomans came, they integrated these areas into the Ottoman Empire and also made Christians part of the Ottoman Empire. Greeks, Bulgarians, but also Jews and Armenians played a huge role in this huge empire that was the Ottoman Empire, and that declined from the 18th century, and in the 19th century then was partitioned, so that from that time onward you have the Balkan states coming up as we know them today. That's basically a development of the last 2 decades of the 19th century, and then the formation of these states in the early 20th century. With other words, new states give themselves an old pedigree by going back to the period before their nations were being integrated into this huge world empires that was the Ottoman Empire, but also the Habsburg Empire or the Russian Empire. So for Milosevic, the memory celebration of 1389 meant that the conquerors of 1389, the Ottomans, the Turks, coming from the east, Muslims, were identified with the Kosovo Albanians that were living there in 1989. With other words, the people that lived in Bosnia and in Herzegovina and in Kosovo were identified as Turks and as former conquerors that need to be expelled. So the ideology of genocide is based on the identification of your neighbors who are Albanians speaking Albanian, who are Bosnian Muslims speaking a Slavic language, the same Serbo-Croat language that you speak, as your enemies, because they are the invaders of the 14th or 15th centuries. This historical projection makes it possible to dehumanize your neighbor, because you protect your you project your neighbor, you understand your neighbor as just the offspring of those who came from Asia with Islam and with force and subdued your families, your communities. And then you have an identification of the heroes of 1389, here Prince Lazar on a painting, with Milosevic himself. He himself becomes a kind of savior and messiah's figure. So he's projecting himself as such, as the savior of the Serbian nation from the atrocities of the Ottomans, with the Ottomans being identified as the Kosovo Albanians. This kind of ideology justified police rule over Kosovo in the Milosevic years. Police rule means that people are being harassed all the time, being taken to the police all the time, being beaten, tortured, raped, lots of rapes. Some people are being assassinated, and a lot of violence is being put on the communities. Communities that are completely Albanian are being ordered by Serbs, by the police and by a governor who is Serb, which means a kind of colonialism approach to this area to keep it in Serbia and to eliminate any kind of idea about an alternative Kosovo. The Kosovo Albanians did a very interesting thing. In the 1990s, in the period when the war is waging in Bosnia, they did not wage war. They did do strikes and protests, so they were let themselves being beaten. They were organizing themselves, but they were not accepting Serb rule, but they were also not shooting back. What they do is they develop a system of non-violent resistance. This non-violent resistance has very much been put forward by students. That is by high school students and some of the university students who said, in order to resist this aggression, we have to do two things. One is, we have to draw the attention of the West onto Kosovo and to show the West that the Muslims of Kosovo are not wild beasts, so that the West doesn't support the Serbs in their propaganda and their narratives about the Kosovo Albanians. That's one thing. The other thing is, we have to refrain from violence. We should not shoot back, because that only means that the oppressor, Serbia, is using more violence against us. So our families will suffer from that. The more we escalate, the more we will suffer. And then comes the most surprising thing, and we have to unite. And the Kosovo Albanians, and you think of a country that is highly mountainous, so a very rugged landscape with villages in the countryside, in the mountains, and small towns, where people have partly been living in blood feuds. That is, villages that are divided over events that happened 100 or 200 years ago, where families would still be fighting against each other. Kosovo Albanian families fighting Kosovo Albanian families, and where male men would sometimes spend their whole life in the home, because they knew if they would go outside to the city square, to the town square, or to the village, they might be shot by other Kosovo Albanians who have a feud with your family. So this customary law, as we call it, the customary law, an eye for an eye or a killing for a killing, prevented Kosovo Albanians from uniting. So what students did in the 1990s is going to these villages, convene the villagers and say, in order to resist the Serbs, we first have to unite ourselves, and we have to forgive the blood feuds. So a kind of Kosovo movement for peaceful resistance in the sense of uniting the nation, but then also organizing themselves. What we get is an alternative administration, alternative schools, alternative hospitals. If the hospitals in Serbia, in Kosovo, are under Serbian control, and you come there with a wound that was inflicted upon you by a Serb officer, the doctor will have to report you to the police. So you don't go to the state hospitals anymore. They become Serbian hospitals with Serbian doctors and with a Serbian intelligence service. You go to an underground hospital, which is in a private house or in a school or anywhere else. So Kosovo Albanians, doctors and nurses, set up an alternative system of medical aid. They set up an alternative system of schooling. Kids would no longer go to the Serb schools, where they would learn the Serbian language, Serbian school books, the Serb vision of the past, but they would be instructed at home by Kosovo Albanian teachers. this kind of underground makeshift administration is very strong, and it even leads to democratic elections. This guy here, Ibrahim Rugova, who is one of the intellectuals of this movement, was elected president in Kosovo while it was still part of Serbia and occupied by Serbia. So an alternative system of setting up a political party, several political parties at that time, and his political party is winning these elections, he becomes president. And out of the underground, after the war is ended, he becomes president of Kosovo until 2006, when he dies. His party for a long time organized this system of underground instruction, underground elections, and this shadow government in Kosovo. Now I want to link what we learned about Bosnia and the Dayton Agreement and Kosovo. The Dayton Agreement was for bringing peace to Bosnia, thereby also appeasing the Serbs and not putting the fingers only at the Serbs. Very careful to get the Serbs on board in order to come to an arrangement of what Bosnia would be looking like, with the Serbs getting their own Serbian republic, almost half of it. But this also meant that Kosovo was completely out of the equation. Dayton was possible because Kosovo was not included. Kosovo became a second theater of war and of repression by the Serbs and of intervention by the Western forces, because it could not be covered by Dayton. Dayton was completely focused on Bosnia, and that is probably good so, because Kosovo including Kosovo would have made the thing almost impossible. So the Dayton Agreement did not have Kosovo instructions, which means Slobodan Milosevic, after the arrangements in Bosnia, had almost a free hand in Kosovo and turned his repressive apparatus onto Kosovo. And now comes the changing point. As this happened after Dayton, Dayton brought peace to Bosnia, but it brought war to Kosovo. The people in Kosovo turned to violence as well. The idea of this peaceful resistance was ending. It was losing force. It was losing traction, largely out of this dissatisfaction that the West hadn't paid any attention. As long as you do peaceful resistance, that was the lesson that many drew, the West will not pay attention. Everybody will love Rugova, and indeed, we cherished him and we took him. He got lots of prizes all over Europe and the world, but at the same time, nobody was taking care of Kosovo. So the Serbs felt they had a free hand, and they started the repression of Kosovo again in 1996, 1997, and 1989. And now comes the process of a spiraling of the force by the setting up of UÇK. UÇK is the Kosovo Liberation Army, the Albanian abbreviation for KLA, Kosovo Liberation Army. So instead of continuing the non-violent resistance, Kosovo Albanians, the youth, turned to violence, knowing that the violence will provoke a response of more violence by the state. So we get into a spiraling of assassinations, of arson, of killing each other. That will create more victims, lead to more violence, but also to more global attention. Obviously, this was the lesson drawn out of the Dayton Agreement, but also drawn out of the non-violence resistance that did not lead to any clear results. We get in early 1999 a massive wave of violence, several thousand people being killed in Kosovo by the Serb forces, but also the Kosovo Liberation Army targeting Serbian police officers, judges, party officers, and the like. In between these two camps, there are still others, like Roma communities, that is, people who are neither on the Serb nor on the Kosovo Albanian side, and other minorities that somehow get into this violence as victims between the two sides. A major refugee movement is starting, and this is now triggering Western attention. On the one hand, the reports about massacres, massive massacres committed by the Serbs and then hidden, so people being buried somewhere in order to erase the traces of the mass murder, and then the Western attention is being grabbed, and this leads to NATO airstrikes. For Vladimir Putin, these NATO airstrikes of 1999 are always being used as the main argument for saying the West is not acting in line with human rights and with the protection of the sovereignty of existing states. Here's a point with the sovereignty, because the NATO airstrikes of 1999 violated the sovereignty of Serbia, which at that time was still in the link with Montenegro, forming the rump Yugoslavia. It was airstrikes formally on Yugoslavia. But these airstrikes came as a protective measure to prevent Serbia from killing formally its own population, namely the Kosovo Albanians of the province of Kosovo. So NATO, without a clear mandate by the United Nations, started to bomb Serbian forces, Serbian positions, over a longer period of time, over several months. And it took several months until Serbia, in the end, withdrew from Kosovo. That is, until Milosevic withdrew his troops. However, this argument that it's the West that broke the rules first, and Putin can now, without punishment, violate the sovereignty of other countries like, of course, Georgia or Ukraine, because the West did that before in 1999. This argument is ignoring the long period of negotiations where the West has been trying to come to terms with the Serbs over Kosovo and to come to agreements about the status of Kosovo. When NATO used airstrikes against the Serbs to get them out of Kosovo, they bombed parts of Belgrade, they bombed parts of Montenegro, but especially positions, military positions all over the place, in order to force the Serbs out of there. This came as a reaction to the rejection of Serbia to come to an agreement about autonomy in Kosovo and about how this should be monitored. The West said, if Serbia is just promising of autonomy, then this must be monitored by international observers, and this is where Serbia and, of course, the radical forces around Slobodan Milosevic would not allow that. They used a pretext for that, and in the end rejected the negotiations, hoping that NATO would not be able to come to a decision about bombing. In the West, nobody thought about Kosovo being an independent state. If you look at the statements of the international leaders of the US, but also of the UK and France and Germany, everybody was saying we're doing this to avoid massacres, to push the Serbs out of the province and the Serb forces, not the Serb population, and then to protect the population and to come to an agreement about the status of autonomy of the province of Kosovo within Serbia. So sovereignty of Kosovo was not the issue for the West. The issue was stopping the mass violence. This is what Putin obviously forgets when he's using these arguments. At the same time, after the KLA triggered violence, more violence in reaction to the Serb violence in Kosovo, also the airstrikes triggered more violence, which means as the airstrikes were unfolding, also the violence of the Serb forces was augmenting in the province until the point when Milosevic withdrew. Milosevic withdrew only after several months, which teaches us another lesson about the idea to use quick airstrikes and to book immediate results. This worked with Venezuela, as we know from this year, but with Iran it's still an open question whether the regime will fall, whether there will be a regime change, simply by using airstrikes. Now, many experts say Iran can simply wait long enough until the Americans and the Israeli forces are getting tired of the attacks or have no more targets to attack, and would have to use boots on the ground, would have to bring in troops. Now, the Western forces were very united in the idea that NATO should not use boots on the ground, should not bring forces, infantry into the country, because that would lead to a protracted warfare to which the NATO armies were not equipped. You don't want to be caught in a kind of warfare in mountain territory where you cannot recognize who is your friend and who is your enemy. So in the end, when Milosevic withdrew from Kosovo, the UÇK won. The UÇK being the KLA, the Kosovo Liberation Army, that brought the liberation of Kosovo from Serb oppression by violence and not by peaceful resistance. A tragic kind of outcome of the Kosovo war under with the support of NATO in that case. The West did not recognize Kosovo as a state. The West occupied and partitioned Kosovo into zones of the military, but it did not have an idea of what to do with it. It still kept on the status of Kosovo being a province of Serbia until 2008, when the Kosovo Albanians, still under the tutelage of the Western forces of NATO and UN, declared independence. 2008, so almost 10 years later, nobody in the West was interested in Kosovo anymore, and we let that happen. There was also hardly any alternative, because Serbia still nourished the old grievances against Kosovo and was not ready for recognizing any kind of autonomy about Kosovo. With other words, the war of 1999 also kept on the division of opinions about Kosovo and led to this stalemate that only ended when Kosovo Albanians by themselves declared themselves independent in 2008. At the same time, this independence declaration was not recognized by the whole world community. In Europe, several states, in particular those that have problems with separatism or with areas that tend to play with separatism, Spain, Greece, deny Kosovo recognition. Most countries in the West by 2008 were tired of Serbian resistance and accepted Kosovo's independence as the only logical outcome after a history of long repression. Again, this was not the point in 1999. This recognition means that there is still a problem now with the minority of Serbs in Kosovo, especially in the northern area, the Mitrovica area, which is yellow here on the map. The areas adjacent to Serbia proper, there you have a Serbian population that is on the one hand a pawn of Serbia putting pressure on Kosovo, but also under pressure by the Kosovo Albanians and by the government in Pristina, that is regarding these Kosovo Serbs as just a force of Serbia. These are problems that the Europeans and the United Nations is still facing. The end of the Milosevic regime did not come with these airstrikes. He survived the airstrikes and he survived pulling out of Kosovo without losing face. Again, the West did its best to maintain relations with Milosevic and not demand regime change. Regime change came from within, from other parties in Serbia that could, on the one hand, show that Milosevic's policies all over the war years have only brought havoc over Serbia, that have destroyed all dreams about a great Serbia, and that have basically time-warped Serbia back into the 19th century. The opposition against Serbia would be, on the one hand, liberals who want European integration, the young people who want European mobility and who have a different idea about Serbia in the future. But there are also nationalists, and nationalists play a huge role in all of the opposition movements that we see in places like Slovakia, Hungary, and other places, Bulgaria as well. You see lots of protests. You can't protest against national ideas. You have to use national ideas in order to protest against a nationalist government that you want to get away with because they are corrupt. They have brought about havoc, in this case here, atrocities. The final argument for today is what happens with these people after the war. For Bosnia, I already said, the post-war arrangement of Dayton means the recognition of the war parties as political parties. So the militias of the wartime become the fundament of the new political parties that now govern the countries. Which means the Europeans that now come in, so first with UN Pro-4, that is with military, but it's a kind of UN mission, and then taken over by the European Union, and the European agencies that come into Kosovo, but also into Bosnia, they have to recognize the wartime leaders as the new governors, as the new politicians, as the new people who represent their nations. Which means there is no post-crime transitional justice on a grand scale. No? Think of Germany after the Second World War, where you have the Nuremberg trials and Nazism is being done away with. But to the contrary, the old perpetrators are still in major positions. They're just now posing as politicians. The war parties were never dismantled, but Dayton largely justifies the old war parties as political parties. The Dayton Agreement is also giving the right to return to refugees. So it's not just about settling the country and partitioning it up into two major spheres and many cantons to keep Bosnia alive and to keep these entities in a kind of balance, but it's also about the return of refugees, and that would be Muslims from areas where they were expelled and killed, but it would also be Serbs expelled from Croatia, Croatians expelled from areas that were governed by Serbs and by Muslims, and so forth. This is revolutionary. Revolutionary in the sense that nowhere else would we give refugees a right to return to the places where we were. With other words, the European-inspired design of Bosnia made sure that the refugees who largely went to Europe during the war can return back to the communities where they were. And this means they have a right to resettlement and also to their old houses, leading to a long process of return and then of retribution, then of getting the old people back into their houses and the newcomers out. Transitional justice. So this instrument, the criminal tribunal, is set up in The Hague, and it has tasks that are limited. On the one hand, it is targeting individuals. It is not. It is not the. This was not me, by the way. It is not the task to identify the Serbs as the criminals and the Muslims as the targets, as the sufferers, the victims. But the task is to identify the individuals who were in charge and who took the responsibility for genocide, for mass atrocities, for war crimes. This was the task of the tribunal in The Hague. Meaning, from the very beginning, the task is limited and selective. Individuals have to be persecuted in order to show the processes that were at work, not to put the blame onto the Serbs or onto the Muslims or onto the Croats. It is also a huge process of gathering evidence, of using experts and using evidence, that is photos and statements, victim statements, in order to create something like a record for history. The tribunal created a huge amount of paperwork that is meticulously giving evidence about any information that we get about the individual atrocities, and this information was then used against the leaders of these atrocities, that is, the persons who in the end became responsible. The pressure that the tribunal could use onto Serbia, but also onto Croatia, for delivering these individuals to The Hague was the process of European integration. The argument is, if you don't deliver these, if you don't extradite these people to us, then we block all negotiations about accession to the European market, and therefore Serbia cannot be benefiting from European funding. No intention to prosecute everybody, but targeting individuals who were very visible in their roles. If you look at the number of indictments, that is of accusations against people, you see the number is very limited. 161 persons until 2004, when basically the story ended. Then, from then on, cases would be handled by courts in Bosnia-Herzegovina or in Croatia or in Serbia. Of these, many were acquitted, 19 acquittances you see here. And among the convicted, most were Serbs, but also Croats and also Bosniak Muslims were among the convicted. This shows you, the evidence here for these trials shows you that there is historical justice, because most of the people who were convicted were really provided evidence for the atrocities that they committed, and most of them were Serbs. There is also not a blind eye on Muslims. Also Muslims have been involved in atrocities and in crimes against humanities in these wars. 1,400 cases were reviewed, which means there was a much bigger pool of cases that The Hague looked at, but then decided to focus on some of them and have the benefit of a clear procedure, of transparent processes, and of giving a lot of power to the attorneys, but a lot of power also to the defense of the people who were indicted. Which means transparency of the process, and that means also televising the procedures, is a huge argument that was brought in favor of these tribunals to make sure that this is not being regarded as behind the doors, as just another victim's justice. The Nuremberg trials of 1946, which led to the death sentences, I believe, of 12 Nazi figureheads, were very quick, with a very limited amount of witnesses, and with verdicts that were, of course, the death sentence for the most important ones. And for the figureheads that were very publicly known, like Göring here, and you see the generals and the Nazi heads. This is not what the tribunal did. The tribunal took years and accepted all procedures, had an appeals procedure, so that anybody convicted could go to another court and in order to appeal it with new evidence and with new witnesses. And often in the appeals, the first verdict was cashed and a new verdict or a new kind of result came out of that. So this is a strong point for this kind of international tribunal. By the way, the tribunal is still there. It's also having other things to do in the future, hopefully. But the tribunal stopped for Yugoslavia. Major achievements are, of course, the bringing to justice of the major leaders in the Bosnian case, namely the Serb leaders, but also leaders of the Croat war against Serbs in Croatia were brought to justice. Sometimes the judgments were contradicting each other, which means one of the weaknesses of having a transparent procedure, independent courts, is that the verdicts can sometimes be pro-Serbs and sometimes be pro-Croat, and sometimes the appeals procedure can lead to a lot of resistance from the victim side that celebrated already the first verdict in the first place. For Kosovo, there is now the Kosovo Specialists Chambers, and that's my last argument, which means also for Kosovo there is in The Hague a court, an international court, that is trying to bring to justice people who committed crimes against humanity. For Kosovo Albanians, this is a very late and very difficult thing to grasp and to accept. You see, this is the indictment, not the verdict, but just the indictment against the leaders of the KLA, including Hashim Thaçi, whom you saw on the one of the first picture, who was one of the leaders of the KLA and then became president and prime minister of Kosovo after the war. So one of the major politicians, or one of those who became the leaders of post-war Kosovo, is now in The Hague and awaiting the court procedure. The court procedure started with the accusation and then the defense, and we're now in the phase where the judges will have to make their verdict. Which means, different from all the other things that you saw before, here the Kosovo Albanians this person voluntarily gave up his position as president and came to The Hague because he said, I have a clear conscience. Now, if you look at these items here, the case is no longer about whether these crimes happened or not, or whether they were crimes or not. Also, the Kosovo Albanian side committed crimes against humanity in that war. That is torture, kidnapping, it is rape, and it is also abducting people. Oftentimes, the victims of these actions that have been discussed by the accusation and by the defense are other Kosovo Albanians. But they're individuals. These cases are about the killing of some people. They are not about the killing of thousands of people. That is, on the one hand, for a court, very normal. A court should, of course, prosecute people who killed others, also in war times. But on the other hand, it is on a very different level than the accusations against Slobodan Milosevic, Ratko Mladic, and Radovan Karadzic, those who stood at the helm of an apparatus that killed thousands of Muslim and Croat people in the war in Bosnia. This is basically, I close the story now, I don't have to discuss this anymore. This is where we are right now. With other words, the Dutch, the Netherlands are very close to these cases. It seems to be far away from us, but the world is looking also at the Netherlands, and we have been very much involved with Dutchbat, with the tribunal for the Bosnian War, but also with the tribunal for the Kosovo War. The Kosovo Albanians are very much looking at The Hague with interest and seeing whether the court will come to a judgment about that, or whether this will end with acquittance. The story will probably continue all over this year, and there is another case still pending. Thank you very much for your attention. We will talk again about post-war transitional justice, but for the time being, have a good week. Thank you.